got a number of panelists here, and I am so pleased that Kelly Hoyland from IMS Global is going to serve as our moderator. We actually had this group doing a panel for IMS Global in the fall, and it was such a great topic that we wanted to bring this back here because it's really, really relevant and appropriate to be talking about this today. So I'll stop sharing my screen. I'll ask our panelists to unmute, please. And I'll ask Kelly to go ahead and share her screen and take over. Kelly.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm excited, as Tom said, to kind of do a repeat performance of this discussion. It was a really solid discussion in the fall, and I'm excited to share it with another group today. So as we look at CLR and we talk about it, one of the things that has kind of come up is how can that CLR really help to support our equity programs? You know, what are we doing to support diversity, equity, and inclusion on our institutions, and what role does CLR play in that? So I'm excited to have this panel here. So our panelists should be unmuted as well. We're going to share a little bit of background information with you and then move into kind of that panel discussion. So to start with, I think, Tom, you have a little bit of context for us.
Oh, thank you. You know, I just thought Tom Green, the Associate Executive Director at AACRAO, the American Association of Collegiate Registrars and Admissions Officers. And, you know, this was such an interesting topic in thinking about student records as an equity tool or an equity barrier. For that matter, but it really is so closely aligned with our equity focus as an organization. And I think the last year, certainly the murders of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor brought such a focus and made us all rethink really more deeply what we were doing about equity and how all of our daily lives and our work impacted equity and were impacted by it. So at AACRAO, you know, we're really strongly committed to this, and it's within our strategic framework, diversity, equity, and inclusion, but it's also in a lot of the actions that we take as an association. And so just to, you know, as examples of those, we have all had for many, many years caucuses at our association. I'm sure several associations do as well, which allow people from historically underrepresented communities in higher education to be able to gather, be able to share their own experiences, be able to connect with one another, feel supported. And certainly we saw last year, our Black Caucus was just super active, and we even participated in the March on Washington at the end of August as a group. We also we support peaceful demonstrations. That March on Washington was a really great example of that. We try and provide resources, and AACRAO does have a resource page that provides a lot of information, links on history, links on resources people can educate themselves and educate others on racial injustice and American history, meaning the complete American history. We also do policy work on issues of inclusion on the national level, and that's one of the things that I think all good associations do, is try to have an impact on different issues nationally. And certainly our location in Washington, D.C. allows us access to be able to do that, but also requires action and strategy and impact. And then we also make sure that we represent the diversity of our members and of American society. When we do things like we try and find authors for publications or speakers at our conferences. And if you go to our conferences, you'll see that there's a real effort to make sure that the people who are up there in front of you and visible in these roles are a representative of the really diverse backgrounds that are represented in our profession. Would you go to the next one, please, Kelly? Thanks. We've embedded this also in what it means to be a competent professional. So as we think about the work of developing records and of using records in the field of admissions, we really want to make sure that our members see this as a fundamental competency, that diversity, equity, inclusion is not an add-on, it's at the root and core of what we do. And so we have a functional description of what that means with it. And then we also have an expert level of what we think is the attainment of that competency. And in that way, this really meshes right into, of course, a CLR and what that really means. And right now at AACRAO, we're actually working on a badging platform for professional development so that we'll be able to, in digital fashion, just as a CLR, be able to allow our members to share their achievements and their competencies with others. So just wanted to provide a bit of an association context to this and why it's so important for AACRAO as an association to be involved in the CLR work. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Tom. So from there, we're going to actually move to Dr. Baker to share a little bit about her perspective and things that we can be doing with assessment to help support this work. So Giannina?
Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm going to share in chat a couple of resources. One is listed on your screen right now, but another I think perhaps adds to this conversation that we've been having for a while here at NALOA with equity and assessment. If you were here yesterday, we got a chance to talk a little bit about how NALOA has played a role in providing professional development and technical assistance to many of your institutions, talking just about assessment and getting people revved up for it. But we've also had a chance to really start to dig a bit deeper into what this relationship between equity and assessment looks like and why it's important. So again, one part that I quoted yesterday is without a focus on the assessment of student learning, the CLR simply doesn't work. Decisions on form, function, technology, and design all hinge upon assessment. And then if we really start to dig deeper, right, and we think about what a good CLR can do, it hopefully will explicitly describe learning experiences that can expose, integrate, and transform students, and in turn place equity front and center. And no longer are the curricula, co-curricular, and beyond hidden and only experienced by those who already knew about such experiences. If we really are wanting to ensure that our students are getting an equitable education, this is inherent in the work. We ask questions to many of you and continue to push on, how are you as an institution ensuring that you're not adding on additional requirements or burdens to students who may not be able to participate in certain activities? Or what are some equity implications that are considered in developing as well as accessing these experiences? Which students benefit the most from the CLR that's designed right now? And then thinking about, as you are aspiring to design it, what could students benefit from? These questions, I think, are very crucial as you think about these experiences, learning experiences that you want students to have. We know that our students come in that maybe have already been employed, maybe are full-time employees, perhaps have dependents that they provide for, or are really engaged in their communities. And so instead of us adding on these additional layers of burden to our students, how can we help include those different experiences that they bring in that might not be institution sponsored or campus specific or just institution driven on such a record? And so I hope that you'll take these resources. If you want to delve even more, I wish we had even more time to talk about what equity and assessment looks like. And we'll get to that in a few of the questions. And I'm sure the following presenters will get really institution specific about things that they've done. But I think that that occasional paper helps bring out what we see that relationship between equity and assessment look like, that really pushes on what Tom talked about, right? That power and that privilege that often our faculty and staff experience, and they're trying to bring students in, right, to facilitate that, not just be the bankers in that transactional experience. So that's just a tiny, tiny piece, but I'll be back.
A great teaser for the following questions later. So to give you a little more context, we're going to go to Xander next to share a little bit about Elon's program. So if you haven't attended their showcase, this is going to give you a little bit of background information and kind of tie in the story. So Xander.
Thanks, Kelly. So good morning, everyone. My name is Alexander Taylor. I am an assistant registrar here at Elon University. I won't get into sort of the elevator pitch because that'll be for the showcase later in the afternoon. But Elon University was one of the first institutions to have developed a comprehensive learner record based on our high impact practices. Also from Mike Sisson, I worked at AACRAO as a research intern and employee for a little bit of time as well. And so I guess to start off, when we were first developing our comprehensive learner record, we were really addressing the data, how this information is captured in our information systems. We utilize our student information system for all of our experiences. And then eventually we got to a critical mass of experiences and data that we actually were able to mine this data. And Kelly, if you want to jump to the next screen. I guess to start off, the work externally from the institution and how this impacts equity and inclusion, that we need to address the impact that this has on employers, whether this does provide a difference maker for non-traditional students that have been disadvantaged from institutions and its impact. We've been surveying employers since 2015 on whether our visual transcript, our experiential transcript makes a difference in employment. And we've seen a lot of positive results from employers about how this provides, paints a different picture of the college experience, that it provides additional information. Of course, at the very bottom, that one saying that that it increases the chance of employment, that obviously it goes to show that employers are a little reluctant to immediately go all in on a new technology that we're not familiar with, and how these experiences relate to work productivity and everything like that, completely justified from the employer standpoint. But I think that it's just a small nugget right now that this information is valuable to employers, and we can provide the right information as institutions to represent the student's experience, the comprehensive experience in college. So next screen. And I guess kind of going off of that, with institutions can get to a level of granularity. I don't know if people have heard the word granularity. I use it pretty often, but we can provide employers very overarching views and overarching information on experiences if it's just as a validating mechanism that they have completed these experiences for an employer. But then we can also get in depth about the specific learning outcomes, the specific assessments that are tested and addressed in our experiences. And you can provide that information to an employer, and it's complete. If we have a document that allows the user of that document to get as surface level or granular as they want to, then creating a document like that is extremely valuable. So this is just some of the information that if we were to provide more information, what are the things that employers would want? And there's good results coming from that. And lastly, I want to touch a little bit about how the comprehensive learner record can help help institutions in achieving strategic goals in their strategic plans, their mission on diversity, equity, and inclusion. That we, as Elon, once we got a robust enough data set, that we were able to mine that information and see what students are participating in these experiences, what are the gaps that we might be running into. Elon, from an experiential learning standpoint, is pushing a lot on access, and how we're trying to shoot for 100% access in global experience. And so access is, of course, extremely important. And is there another screen? Yeah. And so I guess the last thing that I wanted to talk about, we talked about this in the first IMS Global Showcase, and I think that Janina brings up an extremely important point, that a lot of the problems that institutions run into about access is from a top-down standpoint, that institutions are telling students, this is what we count as learning, and you either fit the mold or we don't. We document or we don't. And that has caused a lot of the problems of access and things that students sometimes can't control for, that we can talk about engagement rates with internships with students, but if a student is working full-time, then they can't always participate in that internship. There are things outside of their control that the institution, this top-down approach doesn't work for everything. So we can mine the data, we can look at all the gaps, but the institutions also have a role in working with those students and targeting those specific demographics on how can we provide a better document and how can we provide better experiences for those students. I would be candid in saying that Elon has been many students and administrators at Elon have been wanting on-campus work to be included in our experiences, but because it doesn't fit the high impact practices that are provided by AACNU, that just by that one thing, the administration is still reluctant on providing the information. We've been pushing for many, many years, but I think that just goes to show that that the fight on providing more information and more experiences on the comprehensive learner record is an ongoing fight, and just goes to show that the top-down approach is really difficult to break sometimes. So.
All right, from here, we'll pivot a little bit to Sherry to share some of her contacts that they've done at UMBC in her new role as a consultant with the system.
Absolutely. So just to give background, my name is Sherry Braxton. I'm currently the Senior Director for Digital Innovation at Bowdoin College, 2 weeks in. Previously was Senior Director for Instructional Technology at University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and now serving as a consultant. So our work with the Comprehensive Learner Record has focused on working collaboratively with higher ed institutions and industry partners to define credentials that identify skills that the employers have said they'd like to see students come to their companies with. The target audience here is non-technical students who are pursuing non-technical majors. And I'll get into this in a little bit, but what was happening is you've got all of these STEM majors, they come out of the institutions and you know, based by degree, they can be employed with these companies. We're talking about the Northrop Grumman, the General Dynamics, those companies that you'd find in the Baltimore, DC, Richmond corridor. What they really want to do is open up that pipeline to students who are humanities majors, you know, non-technical majors, so that they can come in with the skills that they need to hit the ground running that are related to data fluency, manipulating data, and those types of technical skills. So next slide. So this Greater Washington Partnership, as I mentioned, is the Civic Alliance of CEOs from the Baltimore to Richmond corridor. And they've formed this Capital Co-Lab, which is a collaboration between 12 higher ed institutions, which include the System of Maryland Schools, University of Maryland, Baltimore County specifically, the George Washington University, lots of other schools in the area, and companies like Under Armour, Amazon, General Dynamics, Northrop Grumman. So they've come together and identified some of the skills that they'd like for these students to come to these companies with. Next slide. So there are 6 competency areas under what we're calling the digital generalist, which is focusing on these non-technical majors, from data and analytics through data manipulation, data ethics, data security. Now the goal here is not to make them, you know, subject matter experts on these topics, but to give them the foundation they need to be able to work within these companies. So next slide. As we looked at the skills that the employers identified, a learning framework was developed, and we call those the KSAs, the knowledge, skills, and abilities needed to perform as a digital generalist. And these are pretty lower level in Bloom's taxonomy, right? It's just to make sure students have an understanding, can do some simple data manipulation, can work within those companies effectively. And so next slide. So what we did so that students wouldn't have to change their majors is to develop some modules to capture these KSAs so that students could demonstrate these abilities. And so we worked with our faculty to map our curriculum against the knowledge, skills, and abilities that were identified, and created these standalone modules that these students could do outside of their courses. So rather than taking a course in data science that would be a 16-week course, they can now go in and be focused on these specific areas of expertise that the CoLab has identified. So next slide. And in order for it to even be more accessible to students, we made those individual competency areas individual badges. So imagine that I've already had a prob stats course. I can demonstrate the KSAs around prob stats through that coursework, but I need to do the other, 5. I can then take the time over a couple of semesters, go through these modules, review the content, take the assessments, and demonstrate that I have competency in those areas. And so in order to implement our CLR, we've used APHIS, and it has 8 tools in its tool suite, but the 3 that we needed were curriculum mapping, the outcomes assessment and evidence collection, and the outcomes transcript, which allows us to implement the CLR. So next slide. And essentially what we've done is we've built out our USM X modules, those edX modules, as co-curricular competency-based courses in edX, along with mapping our courses in our general curriculum that will allow students to also acquire the skills and earn those stackable credentials. So next slide. So the importance of this work and being able to demonstrate a lot of this goes down to the fact that you have to be able to map the learning outcomes. And not only did we want to focus on at UMBC our curricular courses, which follow our functional competencies, but co-curricular activities that students are participating in. So part of our strategy is to capture all of the learning that's happening at the institution, so all students can demonstrate where they're acquiring these different skills. And so next slide. In addition to that, we've been working with the System of Maryland has a badging initiative since 2015 that looks at 21st century skills, because that's another area that employers had identified that when students come for interviews, they're not able to articulate these basic skills. So we're working with faculty and our co-curricular areas to identify where these skills are being attained as well. And in addition to that, we have our employment opportunities and other activities that are happening on campus. Our McNair Scholars Program, students are acquiring these very different skills, student workers in their different areas, and things like financial literacy. We've got a course that helps students gain some mastery of skills on financial literacy. So we have a broad spectrum of different competencies that we're capturing in our CLR to give students, all students, the ability to demonstrate where they're getting these skills across campus. And as I mentioned, if you come to the presentation this afternoon, we're building out the pilot of the CLR using the Greater Washington Partnership work.
Great. Thanks for having some context for our conversation. So as we've learned more about your projects, how is this process really increasing diversity, equity, and inclusion? So what is it meaning for your campus?
Well, I'll go first. I think a CLR it gives transparency for all those types of activities and learning activities that students are engaging in. And so that ability for students to not only be able to identify where they've got competency, but what areas am I lacking competency, and what activities might I participate in order to, attain those skills that I feel like I'd like to have in my portfolio. So just the transparency and ability to have more insight into where activities are providing these different opportunities for learning is important in helping.
I think this is Janina. When I think about this question, and I saw Alexander's one of his slides talked about revolutionizing, and I do think that the CLR potentially has the potential to revolutionize higher ed as we currently see it. As I think about how the CLR process could increase diversity, equity, and inclusion, I'm reminded of the saying that diversity is a fact, inclusion is a choice or a practice, and equity is a goal. And I often think that with the CLR, actually going through that process and the input being the CLR, potentially you are getting to equity. And that's a huge piece. And I think as institutions, especially K-12 and even higher ed, work to this anti-racist educational system, right, where we are uncovering some of this hidden curriculum. I also think that within this space, the CLR allows institutions to be a bit more intentional about the learning experiences that their students are getting. So very dependent on their context at their institution. It's not necessarily based on all institutions. It's there, and they get a chance to really think about what's transformative for their students. We talk a little bit about that standards without standardization piece, right? So by institutional type, we are seeing right now that there's not one right way to do a CLR, that there are many ways to get to that input, again, dependent on your students and your context. And then even thinking about how a couple of people yesterday even talked about encouraging student input. Students definitely can talk about where they're learning and where those learning experiences that might not necessarily be a HIP, a high impact practice, right? For some of our students, maybe there's some other ones that we need to think about including, and also then communicating that back to students. So this allows for a feedback process that maybe doesn't exist at some institutions. And then one last piece that I'd add is that this work takes time, much like any equity work that we jump into, right? So if we're really truly working to not only have equitable access, but thinking about retention and the outcomes that result from that, mapping outcomes and validating evidence is not something that will come overnight. And so definitely the processes mirror each other. And again, if we're really truly working on behalf of students, this could be quite a process that does help revolutionize our higher education system.
Yeah, I agree. And I just wanted to add that I think as institutions start seeing who's participating and earning these different competencies and having a CLR that's pretty robust compared to others who may not be participating, it may inform programming at the institution and the types of opportunities that students are being given. And during our panel, IMS panel, one of the things we talked about was the importance of having a diverse leadership and people at the institutions who are doing the planning of these programs, so they can, create experiences that are attractive to those who may not be participating otherwise. There's a saying, you have to be able to see and do things that you're familiar with, that you see it to be it, a lot of people say. So we need to be able to have opportunities that students feel comfortable participating in that allow them to then expand their abilities through a CLR.
Yeah, I'm going to add just a little bit on, I think, about how the data that we're collecting and using has the potential to do this. Whether we choose to or not, right? That's a different, right? That's the intent part of it. And I really like, Jeannie, what you said. I want to frame that somewhere about DEI and what those things really are. But I think I almost want to think about from a 360 lens, that if we think about what we're doing today and building upon what Sherry said, if we have information that shows where our students are engaging and where they're not engaging and who's engaging, who's not engaging, a lot of us have developed programming that's supposed to, right, add to the experiences of our students. But are our students engaging in them equally or unequally? And did we develop programs that were intended for engagement that are being engaged in by students that we didn't build them for? And I think we've seen evidence of that. And I'm not going to call out this in a negative way at all, but I was just so struck by the data dashboard, or the early ones we saw from South Carolina in Beyond the Classroom Matters, that had this rich set of data showing all of these engagement opportunities across the institution that were just it lit up light bulbs in my head, right? Then I think of the way that I hope someday, right, in the future, that these data will be mined by things like a student putting their CLR in LinkedIn, and it allows something to be mined that way. And then employers will then look for people with talent, which is distributed equally, right? But opportunity is not. I think that comes from Southern New Hampshire, actually, not for me. But can we get more equity in the people who are achieving credentials in the hiring practices by unearthing the data and the information on what they can do and what they've learned, not where they went or their name, those kind of hiring bias type of things that occur all the time. And then even like the third leg of the stool, do we see the potential in the future that K through 12 will be offering us this type of information? And will it allow us to be looking for students who enter our institutions with more information than we've had in the past? And I think this last year in the pandemic, when we've seen almost the elimination of test scores because they weren't available, and schools started to look for other ways to search for students. The risk is that, of course, those new ways they search for students might be less equitable than actually the testing programs they were using. So, I think the CLR has a lot of potential to be able to really inform a lot of our practice. And I kind of think of this 360 direction of looking and using that data for equity.
You did a great segue into the next one. So how is our CLR supporting that transition to employment? Really helping bridge the gap and making sure that learners are being hired based on what they know and not who they are. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think the work that you've heard, Alexander talk about, and what we're doing at the System of Maryland, there's been a huge relationship between the institutions and employers to help with that transition, to make sure students are not only being prepared in their discipline areas, but with these soft skills that they need to be successful. If a student can't sit down and articulate, how they've collaborated, how they've been leaders, how they've been able to do some critical thinking. Those are fundamental skills that translate, so that while they have their domain specific knowledge, they also need these underlying skills. And the CLR can really help to disaggregate all of those activities that happen in a class to identify and pinpoint some of these areas of focus.
Xander, did you have some stories to share or thoughts?
Yeah, it just came right out of my brain. I was just trying to collect it.
Okay.
So I'm sure that people heard a lot from yesterday, but the comprehensive learner record it's interesting because it intersects with so many different aspects of our lives. We're trying to address students being able to use this as a document for their own reflecting, for their own understanding of their learning and what they have attained, where they can pursue and be successful. At the same time, we're also trying to bring in employers, trying to make this a document that's useful to them. And those serve two very different purposes. The designs may be completely different, and the implementations might vary, but the comprehensive learner record is intended to be, in my opinion, intended to be a reflecting tool for students to be able to understand that their learning is not just whatever their major is. And especially as we continue to talk about lifelong learning moving forward into the coming decades, that a student doesn't just, and this coming from a residential campus here at Elon, a private school, that we have 22-year-olds that think, I'm a marketing major, that's the only thing that I know. But those competencies overlap with so many different elements, and people can be moving into so many different areas, but that's where the institutions, both from an academic and student affairs, can support the student in reflecting and understanding what they're learning.
And Kelly, I think even flipping this, I think we need to think about how CLR can support the transition back into education. We have a lot of people who've been working and they decide they want to get a degree or, change their focus. And that prior learning from their employment experiences can really help them to get a leg up on starting on a new degree. So I think it's that two-way exchange that we really need to focus on. It can help in both of those transitions.
And I would add, Janina here again, that if we think about, again, assessment in relation to the CLR, it's not just the transition to employment, but it's also getting faculty engaged in this mapping work so that they even better understand the learning outcomes, not only for their course and how it connects to the program, that connects to the institution, but they can start to explain that to students. So as students prepare for future graduate work or employment, they can then start better explaining that to employers. Because I think that people have mentioned this several times before that we see that people are self-selecting out of potential experiences because they don't know that they can do these things. So the more that our faculty can reinforce, what students are getting in those courses and those in staff with their learning experiences, oh, goodness gracious, they're better prepared for that next step. And then I also think that, and Brenda, you brought up a point in the chat box that we then hopefully are better able to tell employers what these learning experiences are. So many of you have developed catalogs of experiences, and now that's relayed to employers so they can understand a little bit about what students were getting in those. So I think that the more that, again, we do that work before that assessment work, the better off and the more supported our students, faculty, and even employers feel about that transition.
Yeah, I'm going to be just a little bit heretical here and talk about the students who don't finish. Of course, we want our students to gain a credential, right? A high quality credential, and that's a hugely important thing. But we also know that about half of the people who start higher education don't complete a degree. And I think up to this point, we've functioned in a bit of a 1-0 binary equation of you either have the credential or you don't, right? If you started college and didn't finish, you're a dropout, right? Well, we know that people are acquiring skills and achieving things all along the way, even in one semester of attending college. And I think the CLR allows us to provide people with some kind of record of something that they can demonstrate they have done rather than something they haven't finished. And I think that can also be helpful for people. And I suppose too, even along the journey of higher education, people will switch jobs, get jobs. Can these records help facilitate that even while they're continuing to work towards a credential in the long term?
So Mark in the chat had posted a question. For those institutions that do not mandate participation in activities that contribute to this non-curricular record, how do we avoid the negative connotation associated with those students who didn't have one to share? It might be an access issue, but how are you overcoming that? Or thinking about it if you're not overcoming it yet?
I'm gonna add one thing, but I'm gonna prepare Xander here. I'm gonna call him out here to talk about the work they did early on at Elon with the resizing, the visual resizing. So just prepping you for that, Xander. I'm gonna toss the ball to you in a minute. When we were early on in this work, I mentioned yesterday we had been able to consult with people in the UK because they had the higher education achievement record and had it for a long time before we even thought about starting this. And there were some really good lessons learned there about it. And we were able to go to Kingston University outside London, which serves a lot of their former polytechnic. So they attracted a lot of first generation students of color, adults. They had this population that typically we're addressing here. We're concerned about the inequity of their participation. And they had been really thoughtful about this in a way that and this was spurred by the London Olympics. And so they created bronze, silver, gold awards for meeting certain achievement levels. And what they did was they created alternate streams so that you could earn the award, bronze, silver, or gold, but you didn't have to be a traditional student participating in things that happened on campus in order to do that. If you were a working adult, there were alternate streams to be able to help you achieve those things. And I think just really being thoughtful about that and recognizing that this has to work for all of your students, not just those that are going to be on campus participating in student life activities, is an important lens to think about as people are developing their CLRs and what they want to include in those. All right, so given that, I'm going to toss it over to Xander.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. That is a great question, because as Elon's done a lot of marketing with our students. I think that one of the strengths that we've had coming out of the last 5 years is that we've gotten a lot of great information out to students, marketing, and we have put a lot of attention on advising the student from right when they matriculate, being sure that they understand not only just the curricular side, but just the understanding the greater participation and encouraging students. It's a great question because even as we see graduating seniors coming through our office, that this was Elon specific, but we used to have all seniors come into the office for a graduation appointment, that we would run through the degree audit, ensure that they're set and they're ready to graduate by the time May commencement came around. And that was a perfect time for us to be marketing visual transcript, what resources we had after the student graduates, that Elon is still here to help you out even after you graduate. And it was difficult because sometimes you would have students that didn't have very much on the transcript. And so the design of the actual transcript is very important. You want to make it useful for the student to showcase their information, provide enough detail, but if they only have one or two experiences, and having a lot of white space on a document or anything can be sort of off-putting for both the student or an employer or a third party that's utilizing that. So I don't know if I have an answer to the connotation question, but I guess that's sort of some insight from the institutional level.
And there are options. I know in the chat there was some conversation about allowing students to self-report. So that might allow them to, share some of their experiences that happen outside of institution-sponsored things, if they're in a community involvement or things like that. So that might help as well. But other questions for the panel or thoughts that you want to share? Since we started a few minutes early, we might wrap up. So we've got time for questions.
Yeah, and please continue to put things in the chat if you have any questions for the panel. We've got some great comments and a lot of, I think, +1s happening there, echoing a lot of the comments from the panel. I think that these questions are really being thoughtful, right, about this work and really considering the implications, because I do know that a lot of institutions get excited about this work based upon the way they can see it reflecting things that are happening outside the classroom. And so that's a really, that is great, but that may also then reveal, right, some inequitable areas for students who are caring for other kids in their family. Students who have to work 2-3 jobs in order to get through school. What are you going to use as a way to help them? Reflect something in this that's really as meaningful to their progress in this as someone else. And it's not to say that all of our students who come from low SES backgrounds don't participate. That's not true. We have lots of students who participate. It's just they often do it in the midst of even greater challenges with transportation or access to those things. That said, okay, I see that we've got a question in here from, to be partners in undergraduate admissions, from Mike Flanagan at Mastery. Yeah, that's a great question. So how do we get admissions people to be thinking about K-12 and bringing in CLRs from that space? I don't know if any of our panelists have thoughts on that, but certainly we can even open that up to if people want to respond in the chat with that. So I'll ask any of the panelists if they have thoughts on that first.
Well, our undergraduate admissions enrollment management has been involved in some of our other.
Sherry's going to leave us in suspense.
Oh, that's a cliffhanger, Sherry. We lost you there for a second. Yeah.
The internet strikes back.
Yeah, that's right. So while Sherry's unfreezing, I want to go to Brenda Selman's comment in here. The CLR is institutional validation, right? Self-reporting versus institutional validation. That's a great one. And boy, did that come up, especially in phase one, as we were really thinking about what to include in those very early discussions around 2016, 2017. But Brandman University, if you've not seen theirs, they did a really nice job of clearly having these categories of, these are things that the student took from us, and they are part of this because they took coursework from us. These are things that we supervised as an institution. It was learning that happened outside the classroom, but we validated that, we vetted that. Whether it was our supervised or the students submitted it, someone's looked at it and assessed that work. And then they have this third category, which is really cool, which is student self-reported work that they're saying, we're not validating this stuff, but we're posting it here because it's relevant to what the student's doing. And I remember, and Lori Dodge may even be on here and able to post in the chat, that one of the things they had was like a nursing student who had earned a nursing achievement at work. And so she wanted to post that on her CLR as part of that, completely relevant to her degree program and to her record, but not something that Brandman is going to assess and say, did she really earn that nursing award at work? Is that something we'll validate? But it seemed to fit, nicely within that as an example for it. Right.
Tom, I made it back, I think.
We see you, Sherry. Great.
Yeah, I was just gonna. I was just gonna. I gave you the cliffhanger and then I froze. So I was just gonna say, our enrollment management folks have been involved in some of the other credentialing efforts, co-curricular credentialing efforts, and so they have an awareness of what the value is of these programs. And I think that that's how you get them involved. You have to, they have to understand what the purpose is and why it's important. And as they do that outreach to K-12. To see where where those schools are and thinking about that. But first, making them knowledgeable about what the CLR is and what the benefits are for both K-12 and higher ed.
And I would just add, from the IMS perspective, we have K-12 members as well, and there are some districts who have started to issue CLRs to their students, various different reasons, whether it's from the CTE side, and the career and tech side, or from kind of that personalized learning. So they're coming for higher ed. So think about that and have those conversations on your campus are important. So.
Mike Riley had a good question there, which is really an equity question about less resourced institutions that are, how do we help them develop CLRs? And I think, a couple of things hit me right away when I hear that. One is, of course, that, get into a collaborative, right? Find other people who are doing this work and draw upon those resources. It's daunting when institutions think of starting doing a CLR project, as everyone who's a participant in one of our phases here knows. It's a lot of work to do that, and some can sometimes overwhelm. And I think it's very supportive to find other people who've done it, but also you can learn from their resources and learn from that. Then the other part of it that I think of are, I think that there are many companies out there who are really trying to make this as turnkey as possible. And oftentimes the process of doing this work, especially since it's also new out there, isn't turnkey. But I think the more we develop this and the further it goes along and the more that companies work to help people get more of a turnkey solution, I think that's going to really help under-resourced institutions, especially those. I think of community colleges with few IT resources trying to do this work on their own. I think that can be a barrier as well. So thought there. Other thoughts?
I would echo what you said. I think that some of this, much like when we talk with faculty about their assignments, institutions are also like, I don't think I want everyone to know what our students are necessarily getting. So there is a bit of that competitiveness advantage that you want to have of your institution. However, I think that with many of the institutions that have been involved in the CLR project for a while have been very open in trying to work with other institutions that are interested in that obviously it's because it's for the benefit of our students. So I think that this is definitely a step in showing how we can collaborate and work together and learn from each other. And even more so, I think, help us understand what our institution's niche even more, what we can offer to our students, what they know and can do as a result of our education, within ourselves, but if you wanted, even with others. So I think that that's a huge piece. And I also add, someone asked earlier, how do your partners in undergraduate education to partner with this? This work is happening. It might not be the CLR itself, but assessment and mapping and validating evidence is happening right now as we speak. So partnering up with them and figuring out, and maybe potentially helping ease some of this work, I think would be a really good way to start that, but it's happening in many places.
There's been a lot in the chat too on K-12 there that seems to be a really robust area for discussion, and probably something as we think about where this goes in the future, to think about that as well as an interface there. So thank you very much. I just want to thank our panelists and Xander, Giannina, Sherry, thank you for being, and Kelly, thank you for moderating today, putting this together. Great job in organizing. So I'm going to go back and share my screen because we